A dire warning from former top Trump advisors to America. They're going on the record to say that he's a, quote, fascist. Welcome into Talking Points. I'm Jake Morel.
And I'm Luke Radel. We've got 8 days left to go until this election, and there's still reaction pouring into those comments made by the former president's longest-serving White House chief of staff, retired 4-star Marine General John Kelly.
In interviews with Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic, Kelly recounts how Trump disparaged those killed in war as, quote, suckers and losers, and said he wanted generals like Hitler's generals.
It comes after Mark Milley, the top general that Trump appointed, told Bob Woodward for his new book, War, that Trump is, quote, fascist to the core. The New York Times asked Kelly on tape if he agrees.
Do you think he's a fascist?
Well, I'm looking at the definition of fascism.
We got a lot of time.
It's a far-right, authoritarian, ultra-nationalist political ideology and movement characterized by a dictatorial leader, centralized autocracy, militarism, forcible suppression of opposition, belief in a natural social hierarchy. So certainly, in my experience, those are the kind of things that he thinks would work better in terms of running America. The former president is in the far right area. He's certainly an authoritarian, admires people who are dictators. He has said that. So he certainly falls into the general definition of fascist, for sure.
If he was left to his own devices, would he be a dictator if he didn't have people around him?
Oh, I think he'd love to be. He would. He commented more than once that, that Hitler did some good things too. And of course, if you know history, again, I think he's lacking in that. But if you know what Hitler was all about, it'd be pretty hard to make an argument that he did anything good.
John Kelly joins a long list of former Trump officials and aides who are warning against his re-election. You could see just some of the names up on your screen. Mike Pence, his vice president, Mark Milley, the two top names, I think, up there. I remember when Mark Milley sat down and did that 60 Minutes interview and he came out so strongly against Trump. I think that caused a lot of concern for voters who are concerned about foreign policy and war. And if Trump would do something so radical in office as to leave NATO or any of these military organizations that the U.S. is a participant in and really sort of rattle the global stage.
Yeah, and Jake, when you see a story come out like this, it's obviously disturbing to see Trump praising leaders like Adolf Hitler, the most notorious leader of any country of the last century. But also, sometimes we have a parlance in politics, the October surprise, when a story drops super late that affects the campaign. It's hard to really call this a surprise, though. Donald Trump has been using fascist rhetoric on the campaign trail for several months now, saying that immigrants poison the blood of our country, that he wants to be a dictator on day one, that he wants to terminate the Constitution and have military tribunals for people that he disagrees with, calling them the enemy within. So it's really hard to call this anything surprising.
It's not really surprising. And you could go back about a year and go back to his vermin comments, talking about people who are living in America and using Hitler's rhetoric and calling people vermin. And again, you say it's not surprising because of those things, but it's also not surprising, like you said, we saw up on that full screen that we had right there, so many of his former officials, including his vice president.
Well, John Kelly was literally reading off the dictionary definition of fascism, which we have here, and it is easy to see how that definition lines up with Donald Trump. Like, you don't have to take a political science class to be able to see that some of these things, talking about a far-right dictatorial leader, Donald Trump has praised dictators over and over again between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin. And so it's really interesting to see the Harris team and Democrats doubling down on these fascism comments. And to talk more about that, let's bring in our panel, Ilana Epstein and Ronnie Parrillo. They'll be with us on election night, and they're here now to talk about what are the biggest stories that's coming out of this election cycle. Ronnie, what has been the campaign reaction to these revelations from John Kelly?
Yeah, well, Luke, as you might expect, Donald Trump automatically rebuked this. He called John Kelly a total whack job on his Truth Social platform. The campaign also came out swinging against it, saying that John Kelly was just essentially a disgruntled employee. But I think the most powerful rebuke of that was J.D. Vance. Here's what he said on CNN's State of the Union with Jake Tapper. Take a listen.
I actually think there's an interesting conversation here to have, Jake, which is, why does John Kelly not support Donald Trump? It's about policy. It's actually not about personality.
He says he agrees with Trump on most policy.
No.
He agrees with Trump on most policy. He disagrees with Trump on how Trump views his role and his and the fascism and the authoritarianism.
I don't buy that, Jake. I don't buy that, because if you actually look at John Kelly, at folks like Liz Cheney, the fundamental disagreement they have with Donald Trump is, even though they say that they're conservative in the sense that they want America to get involved in a ton of ridiculous military conflicts.
And obviously, right now, J.D. Vance, a staunch defender of his running mate. Obviously, we're in an election year. But also a statement put out by Senator Mitch McConnell, the Senate Minority Leader, and of course Speaker Mike Johnson, saying, quote, "The Vice President's words more closely resemble those of President Trump's second would-be assassin than her own earlier appeal to civility. Labeling a political opponent as fascist risks inviting yet another would-be assassin to try robbing voters of their choice before Election Day." So guys, it did not take long for Harris to jump on this train either. Yeah. She said she agreed that Trump was a fascist in a CNN town hall.
Which, by the way, that statement from Mike Johnson and Mitch McConnell is ridiculous. Donald Trump has called Kamala Harris a fascist like 17 different times in the campaign trail. They never condemned it from him.
Right, and interesting, so what I was going to say is now they're both throwing back this word at each other. You're putting each other on the same level as Adolf Hitler and Benito Mussolini. That carries some weight to it. Yeah. No matter who's doing it, that's still a pretty serious accusation.
Absolutely. I think it does, Ronnie. And I think the other thing is the reason that this isn't as surprising as a lot of people would think if you went back to 2000 and told them this story is that we've seen Trump say so many of these things on the campaign trail. As we mentioned, all of these weird comments relating to like famous fascists and terrible figures throughout history, and it seems that every time it happens there's a backlash from politicians and people running against him, but there's never a huge backlash from voters, and it doesn't seem that he's held to the same standard. And I'm going to bring in our second panelist here, Ilana Epstein. Do you think there's a double standard for Vice President Harris and what she says on the campaign trail versus what Trump does?
Yeah, Jake, this is a super important question, and it's something that's been talked about all weekend long pretty much. There's been a lot of interviews about it. I first want to point out an interview that took place on Friday with Anderson Cooper and Charlamagne the God. In the interview, the two of them went back and forth for a while. It got pretty heated, and Charlamagne said, the networks talk about Trump being a threat to democracy, but don't necessarily do anything about it. And I actually looked at a lot of the comments that a lot of the viewers were saying on the video. They were saying things like, Charlamagne is right, networks are holding these candidates to a double standard, patiently waiting for someone to point it out. Someone also said it's one of the most honest conversations we've seen on CNN in a while. Charlamagne was spot on, et cetera, et cetera. Charlamagne will actually be on, or Kamala Harris, I should say, will be on The Breakfast Club tomorrow with Charlamagne tomorrow morning in person. That should be very interesting. Yeah. But I have to say, these viewers were not the only people to make comments like that. Michelle Obama did, as well as CNN's Van Jones. So take a look.
Kamala Harris and Donald Trump are not taking the same exam. Yeah. And I think it bothers people. They're not taking the same exam. He gets to be lawless. She has to be flawless.
I hope you'll forgive me if I'm a little frustrated that some of us are choosing to ignore Donald Trump's gross incompetence while asking Kamala to dazzle us at every turn.
I mean, lawless versus flawless, that's something really interesting. That definitely got a lot of people talking. I mean, does Kamala always answer every question perfectly? No, but Trump also says a lot of questionable things sometimes, especially with the Constitution, Project 2025, etc. Van Jones says he didn't, he's not always thrilled with how Kamala words everything, but he says he feels like he believes her. And Michelle speaking too, she talked about a lot, but definitely focused on that question of double standard for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the lawless versus flawless thing it's so fitting for what we're seeing in October right now. Again, our October non-surprise, but sort of surprise.